Hello. So I'm giving a talk today on how we fetch data with Gatsby. A quick show of hands, who here has used Gatsby so far? Cool. So let me go ahead and pull all of my...
Scoot this way a little bit.
Yeah, no worries. Slides. So, cool. Yeah, so my name is Andrew Rhyne. I am a cloud services engineer at Gatsby. Really, that's just a fancy word for someone who builds back-end things, really. So don't let the title seem more complicated than it really is. Cool. A couple more things I need to set up here real quick. Awesome. Yeah, wrong one. There we go. So in Gatsby, as most of you probably already know, we use GraphQL as our data fetching plane. So what that means is, like, if you build a normal website without GraphQL, usually what you're dealing with is making HTTP requests to a plethora, either your own backend or third-party data sources, or lots of other random places. And each one of these sources kind of has its own way of doing things. Some APIs will require header-based pagination. Other ones will use query strings. Some of them will return arrays as the global object. Other ones will embed the arrays 3 objects down. So you end up with like this kind of gnarly plethora of data sources and different ways of doing things. GraphQL kind of lets us do everything the same way. So instead of having to integrate with a lot of different APIs or a lot of different constraints, or even if you're using like microservices on your backend, rather than having to make a request to multiple API endpoints to grab lots of different pieces of data, instead you can make one trip to your backend, say exactly what you need, and get all of your data back. So as Kyle mentioned earlier, this makes it really easy to build static sites, because instead of having to write code and fetch data from a lot of different places with a lot of different protocols, we can instead just install a set of plugins, each plugin pointing to a different data source like Medium or Contentful or a plethora of other sources, and we can just fetch data that way. Hold on. Cool. So almost there. Awesome. Okay, so this is like a pretty basic sort of Gatsby config file. It's basically, we've installed one plugin for Gatsby, and this is just a plugin to grab things off of Pixabay, which is a little sort of free image service. Jason was kind enough, I believe, to build the plugin. Yep, so it's pretty cool. It's pretty easy to use too. Before I go any further, does anyone hate Star Wars or puppies? No one? Okay, cool. Then we're good. Because there will be Star Wars and puppies in this presentation. So let me just boot this up, and we can actually sort of look at some puppies or something. Here we go. Talks, ones, oops. I don't know. Step 1. Query. So I just need to clip. I'll just copy it. Hold on. Step 1. Query. Boom. Yeah, so now that we've installed this plugin, which is all pre-assembled, unfortunately, we can just kind of use said plugin to look at some data. So I'm going to go ahead and start this very simple Gatsby like hello world project. Oh, what is this? Oh, yeah. And if we go to localhost, we'll see hello world. Oh, yeah, awesome. Localhost. Boom. Okay. So now if we want to actually fetch a picture of a...
Can you make sure that fits in the window?
Oh, can I? I don't know. Let's see. Pains of a new computer, I guess. Okay, there we go. So if we want to actually fetch data with Gatsby, we can use GraphQL, which comes baked into Gatsby. And we can run a little simple query here to actually, well, sure. Pixabay photo. Yeah, that's right. So we can actually fetch data from our Pixabay source. Edges, node. And this is going to return from the actual Pixabay API like a set of URLs that we can actually render. So as you can see, this is just like step one. If you wanted like a GraphQL source, all you have to do is install a plugin. There's plugins for Medium, there's plugins for this service Pixabay, there's plugins for pretty much everything. Another cool thing we can do is actually stitch plugins from other, so we can actually stitch other GraphQL APIs like GitHub's API or Graph CMS's API into our GraphQL or into our Gatsby project pretty easily. To do that, we just add another plugin. And with this plugin, we're installing the Gatsby source GraphQL plugin right here. And we're just going to specify a type that this API will return. So we're going to call this Swappy, because I guess that's a type. I didn't know. Star Wars API. Yeah, that's right. We're gonna call it in our query definition the Swappy field, and we're gonna fetch Swappy from this API below. So this is really all you have to do to stitch in another GraphQL API. If we go back to our browser.
Can you talk a little bit about what schema stitching is?
Yeah. So when you make a GraphQL operation to a backend, like a GraphQL server, usually the typical way is you'll have a big definition of all the different types that your API can serve. And when the GraphQL request gets processed by your GraphQL server, what it does is for every type, it makes an HTTP request or some sort of operation down to an underlying data source. That could be a database, Redis, Mongo, or it could be some other API. It doesn't really care. It just allows you to send one trip to from site to server, and then the server can multiplex that request and distribute it down to a lot of different data sources. Sometimes those data sources themselves support GraphQL. So schema stitching allows you to say, okay, there's another GraphQL API over here. The GraphQL specification sort of provides us for this thing called introspection, which basically means that if there's a GraphQL API, you can hit like a meta API and say, what all do you provide? Like, what are your types? What are the fields on those types? How do the types interrelate? So with schema stitching, Gatsby hits the introspection API on a GraphQL source, and it tells Gatsby, here are all the fields I provide, and then when you write queries in your templates, it'll actually just forward that portion of the GraphQL operation onto the backend that supports that part of the GraphQL schema. So if we expand our little, Star Wars thing here, we can, oh yeah, great. You can actually see more cool stuff from our GraphQL API. So we're going to go Swappy, all files, title. And this is going to get us a list of Star Wars movies. So if we say Swappy, let's let our server fully boot. So Swappy. Oh, yeah, I do. You're right. Yep. All films, and we're going to get the title of every Star Wars movie. If we do this, now we'll have two different pieces of data. We'll have all of the titles of all of the Star Wars movies in this one field called Swappy, which corresponds with this swappy piece right here. Then we have all files, which is an array. And then under every file, we have the title. And then if we go down here, again, all Pixabay photo, edge, node, and then the web format URL. So this is kind of boring. No one likes looking at data. So let's actually look at a picture of a puppy. That sounds a lot more fun than what I'm doing right now. Yeah. So the second step, we obviously have the same kind of thing in our config. We also have, well, let's step 3 index. We also have a little template. So is that all fitting? Yeah, cool. So on our template, we have a request for a Pixabay photo, which is going to return a dog. And we are going to request, along with the Pixabay photo, every Star Wars ID and title for every Star Wars movie. So if we refresh, there's your dog, and there's all your Star Wars pages. Now if we click this right now, nothing happens. You get like a 404, which we should, because there are no pages yet. So for my next trick, I will show you how to do something called page queries. So a page query is, well, let me take a step back actually. If we go back to step 3 and we look at the index file again, we can see that this is just one static GraphQL query. There are no, like, what happens if we want to actually like render a set of pages based on some variables, or if we want to pass some options in our query? We can do that with GraphQL. It's super easy, just like with REST. So static queries don't allow that. Static queries say you know exactly what you want to render one thing. That's useful for things like marketing landing pages, where you don't have like a set of things like you would with a blog post. You just kind of have one thing. And it may be backed by like a CMS where you want to tweak your marketing language and try to improve your funnel conversion rate. But if we want to like render a set of blog posts, we want to use page queries. So page queries are implemented a little differently. We have to write a new webhook, and this is just part of the Gatsby API. It looks for a file called gatsby-node.js, and it assumes that file exports potentially a set of functions. One of those functions is called create pages. This function gets called during the compile process when Gatsby is actually generating pages. So what we're going to do here is we're going to return a promise from this function, and that promise is going to invoke the GraphQL API for Swappy, fetching all of the film titles like we did before. And then for every film, we're going to create a page. So we're going to iterate across all of the pages, or all the films, and with each film, create a page. And that requires a template file. So let's look at that. So here's our template. So for every page, it's going to pass in as the GraphQL result this little fragment right here. And we're going to simply render out the title of the movie and the director. So oops. So here we're going to go ahead and see Gatsby render all the pages that we just specified. So you can see here it's actually running 10 queries instead of just like one. And that's because it's rendering like an additional query for every page that generates it. And we're also generating multiple pages, not just one, because it's rendering a page for every Star Wars movie. So if we go back and we refresh, we can actually click these now, and they actually go to a page. And these pages are rendered dynamically with content fetched from a GraphQL API. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. No, it wasn't super exciting. Sorry. Star Wars and puppies, not everyone likes them. Yeah, what's up?
How does, behind the scenes, how does Gatsby actually do this fetch?
So I believe, I'm still new to Gatsby and the team. I believe the way this works is we actually sort of queue up the different requests that we need to make as we process the pages. And then there's a step where we actually flush all of those out and grab the data that we need.
So
And Kyle, I'm sure, can elaborate more on that.
it's programmatically then controlled by the plugin. So the plugin will, have access to whatever secrets you need to log into your CMS or whatever, right?
Yeah, usually you end up mapping those configurations in your config file, and those can in turn be mapped in the environment variables, or if you want, you can go interpolate them into environment variables from something like Vault. It really depends on your own sort of needs.
So is it the promise that controls, so if the data changes on the API, you have to, the promise, do you actually get that data, or you have to?
Yeah,
build
so,
the site in order to get the,
yeah, so,
how does that work?
yeah, so this tends to involve, for people who are kind of rolling their own build infrastructure, a bit of yak shaving. And for people who aren't familiar with that term, it's just crap you have to do before you can be productive. So usually there's actually a thing called a refresh data webhook that's built into the Gatsby open source core. And if your data changes, if you have a server that's running builds, you can actually just hit that endpoint, and your plugins will automatically refresh and grab data sources from everywhere, diff it against the existing cache, and rebuild what's changed. Refresh, I think it's just called the refresh endpoint, right?
But it's just for running develop.
Yeah, if you're running develop, yeah. If you're not running develop, you just have to detect that and then run a build again.
You do it
With a webhook, yeah. And a lot of people use like a CI solution for this. You can, with Circle or Travis, you can actually cache your existing build cache, pop it back in, run the build on top of it, and you should be good to go.
I'll jump in with a really easy solution for this. So one of the ways that we've seen that's very easy to do this in production is if you have data that's going to update relatively frequently, like not up to the second, but maybe every few minutes, every hour or so. Netlify is a really good solution for this because they have webhook support. So what you would do is on your content layer, you can register a webhook, whether that's with something like Contentful or with really whatever you're using. Whenever your data changes, Netlify can trigger a build based on pretty much any webhook. So you register that webhook with them, and whenever it fires, they will rebuild your site. So as far as like getting your data up to date on the website, once you've configured that webhook, you kind of just get to forget about it because your site will rebuild anytime it changes.
So that kind of takes the place of a watcher?
Well,
A watcher on
the watcher is something that you would want in like when you're developing the site.
Yeah.
In production, you probably don't want to have the benefit of static sites is that you don't need long running processes.
Right.
So it removes the need to have those long running processes because it's all kind of push based. Your content says, here's some new, we have something new. And then that just spins up Netlify long enough to build a new version of the static site. And then you still don't have any long running processes.
That said, stay tuned. There might be something that removes the need to think about this at all.
Yeah, that's what Gatsby Inc., the commercial company, that's what we're going to be rolling out, is products to help with live preview. We're aiming to do things that will help you kind of build in real time. Lots of things that are coming down on the product roadmap, and we'll be sharing more details as they become more solidified in our own heads. Any other questions?
Yeah. So I don't want to, no one really does that anymore. That's actually older sort of relay standards.
It's graph theory. So in the original versions of GraphQL, it was very heavily based on graph theory, which is the idea that data is connected along edges, and at each edge are nodes that represent relationship. It's not used as often in like modern GraphQL, but Gatsby was at the very bleeding edge of GraphQL when it first became a thing. So it's something that is becoming less common. Like when you schema stitch in, you won't see edges and nodes as often.
Exactly.
I don't know, Kyle, is there a plan to move the Gatsby like internal creating nodes away from edges and nodes?
It's something we can certainly do. We have
To repeat that for the people on the stream, it's something that we could certainly do, we just haven't done it. So if you want us to do it, get into our issues. Come to github.com/gatsbyjs/Gatsby and tell us what you want. We're really interested in having you in our community. You know, we're kind of moving toward the slogan like, you belong here. We want you here. We want to hear what you have to say, and we want you involved in the process.
Absolutely.
So please show up and come talk to us, because we want to build things that you want to use.